My name is Paz, and I thank you, Lucas, for inviting me today to Poland, Szczecin, to be with you. I'm Spanish, so English is not my mother tongue. I think mostly, for most of you, is the same. So maybe we understand each other, maybe not. But I hope. I will put my mouse, okay? So my name is Paz. I come from Spain. I'm an art historian, and I live in Berlin for 9 years now. I am a kind of curator that I couldn't find a definition for. So for the last 2 years, I've been saying that I am a process curator. I don't know if you can relate to that, but I felt more and more uncomfortable just having to produce exhibitions as a place of knowledge. I fell out of that longing for exhibitions, and I am basically working with a collective in Berlin for the past 5 years. It's called Agora Collective, but this collective died this year, and we are making a new one. And we're moving to a cultural complex called UFA Studios, which is very centered on body-based practices. I don't know if you have ever heard about it. So basically, as a curator, I do a lot of programming. But as I said, what means process curator basically is this area, no? That is a bit more focused on the architecture of the encounter and the quality, no? And the time and the length. I do focus a lot on slowness, but my life is very fast. Or at least very self-exploited as well, because I work with the independent art scene, no? With its degree of compromise, politics, and self-exploitation. I also work very much interdisciplinary, and I specialize in collaborative artistic practices, and this is how I got to Cuba, which is the topic that Lucas told me that would be good to talk with you today. And I brought a lot of books. I have my house file over there. I will bring it. Well, the idea is that you can just take them. I heard a lot. So through collaborative artistic practices is how I got connected to Cuba. Actually, it was in November 2017. I was in Poland in the MŁODE Festival in Frankfurt Oder and Słubice. And there I was participating in a conference that was Artists as Actors of Urban Change, and I met this interesting collective from Cuba that is called Laboratorio Artístico de San Agustín, which would mean something like artistic lab, no, of San Agustín, which is a self-organized space, and I will go into details later about sustainability models in Cuban art context. But basically they make their 10th year anniversary. Their field of practice has to do with relational art and contextual art practices, and they wanted to create a series of books and catalogs to kind of envelope these 10 years of experience. So this is when I joined the project as an editor of this series of books, and as an editor that could be more creatively involved as a curator, no? So basically, the talk of today, it nurtures from that experience that I had. I went to Cuba in many phases: research, production, etc. In the end, we presented these books as part of a performative dramaturgic setting in the La Sabana Biennial. It was a very long participatory process. And what I wanted to share was today like a very fast, humble, incomplete, but I hope interesting overview of some things that I learned about the Cuban artistic context through my engagement in this project. Okay, some questions are, how is being an artist in Cuba? What is the role of art and how artists are perceived in society? What channels are there to support contemporary art? What strategies do artists follow in order to be sustainable? What means independent production and self-organization in a non-liberal market like the Cuban? It's a very different context. Is there an art market? And that's a question too. But I will also share questions that I haven't been able to answer in these 2 years working very, very much there for long periods. For me as an independent producer to be able to spend 3 months in 3 different moments of a year is also like a lot of organizational commitment, and I think I spend there a quite good amount of time. But anyway, these questions trigger me like a higher interest to continue researching and studying about contemporary Cuban artistic practices. And is this big question, like, is there political art in Cuba at all? No? And I will tell you some details that, and maybe we don't need to form an opinion, but it's an interesting debate that is happening there, and that I, as a European, I never thought about it, if there is political art at all, no? And what means public space in a place where the space is communal in itself, what other significations, meanings, and logics are operating there. I will focus on one type of artistic practice that is very present in Cuba, especially in the last decade, is contextual art. And I don't know if you're familiar with that way of naming it, because it, you know how art terms are working a bit differently, depending which school you associate with or which part of the world. And basically, it's also called dialogical art, literal art, relational art, but it comes from this idea of relational aesthetics, which is this field that more or less was defined, observed, or highlighted by Nicolas Bourriard, who brought to the attention of the Western critique at the end of the 90s this idea of relational aesthetics as a set of artistic practices which takes as their theoretical and practical point of departure the whole of human relations and their social context, rather than the independent and the private space. And that is to say that relational aesthetics projects tend to break with this traditional idea of the physical and social space of the art gallery, and the art is kidnapped and absorbed alone in the studio or the atelier. Relational aesthetics takes its subject as its subject the entirety of life, as it is lived, no, on the dynamic social environment, rather than attempting to mimic or to represent, no, an object that is removed from daily life. And it is interesting, no, this relational theory of Bourriat, because it contains everything that Europe doesn't have, no, a bit, or didn't have in that moment. No, we're talking about 98. Yes, this lack of connection in European contemporary art with the public and the need for that search, that was a bit the horizon of the relations of that moment, was that longing, big longing for the public, and it's a late desire in the so-called Western world. But I would say that he appeals to important sources as well of Latin American and the Caribbean, no? Inspired by the relational aesthetics formulated by Edouard Glissant regarding the Martinique and Caribbean art and Caribbean culture in general, this idea of poetics of relation, which is very similar to the aesthetics, the relational aesthetics. It's written way before, no? And there is a whole corpus of practices like earlier, no, Brazilian art of the 60s, Ligia Clark, no, there is another genealogy, Elio Oitichica, no, but let's say that anyway it's codified by Bourriat at this point, and it became part of our vocabulary through him. And I think that in the Cuban case, much of this art went out into the streets and sought to establish other dynamics with the public, no? Even with the public not understanding very well if they were part of an artistic event or not. The artists were producing an effect on them and creating, contributing things to the life of these people, no? So in Cuba, this type of art, call it contextual or relational, when it has existed, has always searched for that connection, and how to make that connection with the public, no, and what happens in making that connection with these dynamics of the social. So it happens that contextual art becomes a frame blended or camouflaged with this whole of human relations. It is an action, but it has a form, it entails a space, and it is made of time, no? So in Cuba, various components of the social context become the work's protagonists, no? A state of sensitivity, a form of reflection, humor, especially humor, ideological practice, the genre or art spilling towards the context, no? And each one of these elements presents itself as a protagonist who sums up intensive dialogues from daily life, no? Generally, contextual art nourishes from the spaces where culture manifests itself daily in a place. The actions underlying these spaces work on the material and the immaterial basis of what exists. It is an artistic language whose vocabulary is exactly made of the realm of the everyday life, no? So the aesthetic operation here would be to superimpose a new imaginary, no, to the practices and places of the everyday, consciously adjusting this gap between what we know and the familiar, the strange difference, and producing affections and new symbolic links with this community, no? So in these spaces where contextual art lives, of course, it's because of its temporary nature, it generates ephemeral landscapes, no? Within the territory where it happens, no? You go through your neighborhood and you have this accumulated mental archive of how it has been transitioning through other artistic lenses, and in the memory of the people who lived or experienced that moment, no? So this is a bit the work that I have done for this artistic laboratory of San Agustin for their 10th anniversary. San Agustin is a periphery of Havana. It's like 12 kilometers. It's a whole district. It's a very interesting urban arrangement, because it summarizes pretty well the entire history of Cuba, from big plantations to of fruits, no, and slavery and cemeteries of slavery, and Batista dictatorship. They have villas there because it was very fragrant. And then after the revolution, they experimented with the first Soviet imported housing models, the A14, no, which are these very big modular prefabricated buildings, because Cuba had a very big problem of where do we feed so many people. We don't have enough materials, we don't have enough anything, no. So San Agustin, it's a good place to speak about context. The Cuban context is a bit of a model, and yes, so LASA, to shorten it, this laboratory, what they do basically is that they organize residencies for international artists and invite them to work with the context, no? They have a lot of staff working with them, they have a lot of volunteers, and they have very welcoming neighbors, and this is why the project exists for 10 years now, apart from being an economic success, and I will tell more later. And these neighbors are actually very proud of being attached to this kind of self-organized art center, and welcome the foreigners and show them their neighborhood and their territory, no? So imagine an entire district of your hometown or your village hanging out with foreigners every month, no? In a context like the Cuban, that perhaps 10 years ago it was forbidden, no? To exchange a lot of information in several types of conversations, no? It was more courtesy and directions. So the result of these 10 years is like a huge archive of interventions in the public space and participatory projects with the community of San Agustin, and I went there a bit to research and study the archive and propose a new curatorial, we say transversal reading, but somebody told me one time, it's stupid to read transversal, but it's one of these curatorial words. Anyways, to give a new look, no? That's what a curatorial task implies in rearranging a collection of things that already happened, no? So I wanted to look at it through this lens, no, of the places where culture manifests itself every day, that contextual art underlines. And then I found a local author, Orlando Hernandez, that actually speaks about how in Cuba in particular, no, not in contextual art in general, but in particular, inhabitants, no, of the island have been participating, no, sorry, because I don't see it very well from here. They have been participating in these practices without the need to attend galleries or museums or pursue academic studies, no. These are spaces that still have creativity, imagination, and intellectual depth. And their usual spaces of creation, participation, exhibition, and consumption are this list that I took as an inspiration for this rereading of the archive. The street, the house, the body, means of transportation, workplace, religious spaces, and of course nature, no? So except of nature, that I didn't find any correlation with any of the projects done there in San Agustin for 10 years. I took this, no, as a proposal, and we started re-archiving that decade, no? And basically this whole catalog evolved in a biography that I also wrote about them, and then a specialized publication which mixes voices from contemporary Cuban authors and some international ones, and this is called The Energy of the Context, reflections about collaborative and contextual art practices, and it's one of the parts of the book. And I don't know if to show you in detail. Basically, this is what we presented in the Wilfredo Lam Contemporary Art Center. It was a bigger event. The idea was that the community was engaged and everybody became the voice of the book. We did a special dramaturgy. These are foldable posters. And that are like maps, no? And yes, so we just played a bit with this idea of the territory and this ephemeral landscape, highlighting some of the actions that were more beloved by the neighbors of San Agustin, not by the organizers of this art center. So yeah, this is just to visualize a bit the landscape that is inside the catalog. These, as I said, are all projects that were realized by foreign artists after several lengths of stays, no? In San Agustin as a neighborhood. Okay. Good. Yes. So apart from this context, no, like this uniqueness of the context. Please take, thank you. You want to pass them around? Okay, so this is just in relation to the topic of daily life and entering in a dialogue with daily life. But then in Cuba there is this specificity that it is combined, the uniqueness of this context with international art world, no? Through the existence of their biennial, which is organized since 1984, and it was born a bit as a model in itself. No? It was a radically different biennial model. It didn't try to imitate the Venice Biennial. It didn't try to mimic this national structure of pavilions and so on, because this is the European biennial model, or to show the latest commercial art. No? Obviously, in a socialist environment, what resonated, no, with the culture sector behind the initiative of the biennial was to follow a thematic approach of topics such as tradition, contemporaneity, challenges, art, society, reflection, man and his memory, life, art, and urban art. No? This became a bit the corpus of practices and topics they were dealing with. The artists came from Cuba and the Caribbean in the first edition of the 84, and later, no, it expands to show African and Asian artists. So it becomes this self-denominated biennial of the third world, and there's a lot of discussion about that, which is super interesting. And they don't follow this Western, no, art meeting presentation, and it's the first non-Western meeting of such a scale that was a success. No, it exists for 30 years, but it's a miracle that it exists. I've worked with this biennial for a year and a half, and it's very precarious, as the rest of the situation economically in the island. It's a beautiful event, and the highest of Cuban contradictions. No, it's the work of three curators, basically, the directors of the different national institutions in Havana, the director of the Wilfredo Lam Art Center, which is Nelson Herrera, the director of the Fine Arts Museum, Jorge Fernandez, and the president of the Association of Critics, Danis Monte de Oca, and they take turns, they curate the biennial in different moments, they direct the biennial, but they're all part of a board, no? So in the Red Book, the energy of the context is basically their conversation, no? This is why we got this interesting crossed interview about many subtopics that have to do with art production in Cuba. So just imagine that an event is organized 30 years by the same people and working with the same cultural ministry, because positions in Cuba are for life, no? So culture is really the portrait of one personality, no? And this leadership model is very much also a mirror of this Fidel Castro, no? personalization of politics, which exists in the cultural policy as well, no? Of course, this model has its problems. Of course, it's not transparent, and of course, it's mission impossible when they don't pay artists a single cent. When there is a few materials to work with, no, foreign artists need to bring their screws, for example, to install, and they have to work with international funding bodies and partners who fund their productions and travels, get visas, which is always a problem, because when you get a visa comes the inspection process. Who are you? Why are you getting a visa? No, and then what is that you're going to do? And then you have to virtually anticipate a lot of details and camouflage a lot of language, because there is a censorship committee as well, which we have to pass with the book. For example, I was not allowed to use the word democracy, no? And it's an interesting debate for me to think it was a bit of a decolonial way of thinking. I won't use democracy because maybe this was not the intention of this artist. Not every relational art practice or collaborative practice, maybe in this context, is speaking about democracy. Is speaking about choices, speaking about democracy forcefully. Is there other ways of being free and having alternatives than it's not democracy? So that was like many internal debates that happen around the fact that we just couldn't use that word, or grassroots movements, or the typical vocabulary that you're used to attach to these practices when you're working and writing from here, no? And okay, so what distinguishes also this biennial mostly from other mega exhibition events, it's this connection with the public, no? This effort to enter actually the social tissue, no? Of the biennial, this ability of this cultural platform to create new audiences, and audiences that are different than the typical biennial consumer public, no? We are speaking about working with communities of scientists, for example, librarians, activating other spaces in the city, factory workers of a pharmaceutical industry, for example. So it's a huge organizational effort with very few resources, more than the venues of the biennial in itself, no? And for example, if you have to fight for the permission to work in the public space, being a foreigner is much more complicated. As I said, it's a very challenging format, the biennial. So, and it doesn't happen every 2 years. That is the aspiration. But I found this thought, this way of working institutionally very honest. The biennial happens when it happens. We have the intention that. Oh, really? Thank you. It is an aspiration, but it's not a calcifying requirement. They are organizing it when they can. Then there is a lot of satellite events. For example, this is the ISA, the Higher Institute of Art. This is one other model that is being very polemic right now, because they have bus excursions to pick up collectors that come to the biennial, and they bring it to the artist studios so they can purchase work directly. And many people are against this idea because they think it's going too commercial, no? Into this typical liberal economy that we have, but they are supposed not to have. So there is an internal debate into what the institution is at this moment. Okay, there is, I don't have time because I lost a lot of time, sorry. There is other possibilities to promote artistic practices, in the sense that there is the Centro de Desarrollo de las Artes Visuales, also a partner of the biennial. They organize the Salón de Arte Cubano, the Cuban Contemporary Art Salon. Always these formats sound like very vintage for us, but they still have meaningful ways of gathering and critiquing, even though for us they sound rigid and academic. And then one of the things that, in connection with this idea of Havana Biennial as a triggering, no, of this mediation aspect of what a biennial can be in terms of imaginary of an institution, no, There is a phenomenon in Cuban art since the 90s that is this figure of the artist pedagogue, a tradition that exists until now. And is these teachers basically that go beyond the walls of the academia and try to make a space for learning and artistic creating in the city and in the margins of the city, taking the entire city, no, as this place of action. Well, there's a very big genealogy of artists: Eduardo Ponjan, José Ángel Toirac, Tania Bruguera, René Francisco, Ruslan Torres, no? And a lot of collectives that are formed also in forming micro collaborations between these teachers and the students of these academic years, like the DUP, Enema, DIP, and Arte de Conducta is already the one of Tania Bruguera, no? So in the case, the interesting thing about this artist pedagogue role is the level, no, in which they are positioning aesthetically in terms of agency, you know, how these artists, for example, La Casa Nacional, it was a very famous project of René Francisco, the founder of this DUP group movement with their pedagogic pragmatics. So he takes the students to live in a community, in a neighborhood, no, in order to learn about the experience of the neighborhood. And they remain there several days, they live with the families, they share with the families, and from the demands of the family emerge the works of art, no? So it is, the artist was subject to this social fabric, no? But what they would demand, no? And there were families that asked, for example, that they would paint a Virgen de la Caridad, which is this local national religious idol symbolizing the freedom of slavery, so it's a beloved image. And other families asked to have their homes repaired. So that exchange, no, determined that the work responds to that demand, and that is truly this idea of art of social insertion or relational art, a bit beyond what Borja was meaning with his definition of relational art. Then Arte de Conducta is one of these experiments that take place within the cluster of the ISA, this Academy of High Arts, from 2002 to 2009. Again, it's playing with this idea that the priority is useful art. It has to do more with finding the cracks, no, and repairing for some of the cracks, no, that you find in the social tissue, and respond to the environment. Another group that was formed inside Cátedra de Conducta, which were happening in the form of workshops that were 1 week long, for example. So in one of these groups formed more collectives, and in this case this duo, Luis Miguel, Luis Garciga and Miguel Moya, they have this work which is called Bueno, Bonito, Barato, is good, pretty and cheap, which is what you say when you're advertising something in a market. And they make this work, and that is following like a similar approach to the relational, no? They call it Reporte de Ilusiones, which is a report of dreams. Let's say they survey the entire neighborhood surrounding the center of Old Havana, in the center of the city. They visit several families, they go to homes, and they propose to make a photo of whatever they like most to keep as a memory in their homes, no? What would they dream to be portrayed with? And then from this, there's a whole variety of conversations that are happening, no? In the case of one lady that wanted to be photographed with the President of the United States, but then she said, oh no, I'm gonna get into trouble. So better you photograph me and with a picture of Fidel, no? So this is also a different case than the Casa Nacional, because in this case they are playing with entering the social tissue, but through Photoshop, these photographs end up being exhibited in a gallery, no? So it's a bit of a different strategy. And then here comes the tricky part, the relationship between art and politics, which is a matter of survival economy, not materialistic. No, I don't mean it in a materialistic level, because the scarcity of materials is a given. I mean the survival economy in terms of coercion and freedom. No, there is this very difficult equilibrium or balance, which becomes a whole pedagogy in itself, between dogma and invention, no? Between freedom of thought and the lack of it, no? So this is the topic that led me to think if actually there is political art in Cuba. And Nelson Herrera, which is one of the artists, one of the directors that contributed to the energy book, tells us that in the 60s and in the 70s, the artists had always been very affirmative, very positive, with little or no conflicts, no? But in the 80s, something starts to change, and for the first time, the artist enters politics in a critical way, as they never did before. And what happened in the 80s is that there was a whole context of exodus, like there is a context of diaspora, no, of Cuban artists that are leaving the country, and this starts creating breaks and fractures, and creates like a very violent psychological mood that it is in some way treated by artists, but in a very, I don't want to say superficial, but in a very distant way. No, the violent psychological moral of the time, it was not really reflected by the artists. No, they took, as I say, the breaks, the fractures, the anecdotes of what that meant, but not how the Cubans really felt it. No, this is in the 80s. So there is this very important argument and a very contemporary debate in Cuban art context right now. If there is political art, is there an art that questions socialism in Cuba, or is it only art that goes to aim at covering those fractures, breaks, or anecdotes, no? And what can art do? And I have just 3 examples. Lázaro Saavedra, the principal meaning of his, like 3 ways of seeing politics through art, no? Where the principal meaning of his works is display of between text and image. The text and context become very interrelated. It's like reading works of art as text, basically, no? And this dialogue deconstructs a bit these highbrow references by inserting them in the daily life. This is the detector de ideologías. It's an ideology detector, and it goes, it's 92. 92 is exactly after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the US embargo, so this period is called the special period. And they make a local joke in Cuba that if every country has a crisis, but if your country is always in a crisis, the biggest one becomes special. This is why it's called the special period, no? Okay, so this it's characterized by an economy of means, and this ideological, cultural, and ethical force of all the meanings that are combined in these references in his work. This is a bit later, but from 1987 to 2013, but it was exhibited in a biennial in 2013. Marx sculpture, busto, upper part of your body, and then Chevrolet 1955. No, as I say, he has this play between text and image, and one function of all of the political art that is very close to this generation, that is close to graphic arts. No, identify a lot with this. Reading works of art as text. No, this is this paratext, hypertext culture of censorship environments like the Cuban one. And then in antagonism to this more soft version of that is a bit publicity-like messages, we have Tania Bruguera, who after the School of Behavior, this Arte de Conducta, she evolved as a solo artist, married activism and started to denounce very proactively and provocatively the dictatorship of Cuba. No, she went to jail many times. I mean, for some hours. She was banned from the country sometimes, and she was forbidden to come back, etc. And regularly she comes back, and she plans to do another public performance, for example, like Tattling Whispers, in the public space with a microphone, inviting people to openly say what they don't like about socialism. And because there is no freedom of speech, of course, the artwork is not going to see the light. But in the meantime, she gets a lot of media attention, and this is the regular Cuban artist doesn't forgive Tania Bruguera. You speak with a lot of people, and they are in diametral opposition to her life and to her artistic persona from Arte de Conducta to now. No, basically, she's an artist who doesn't live in the country. They say she's not part of this dialogue with the everyday life anymore. But she wants to shout once every now and then, and this is some notes that I took because I interview many people there. The media doesn't speak or comment or critique the work of anybody else. No? So this is the problem of the biennial, which is this dispositive where external press and critics and some other people can get to know a lot of local artists, but there is this spectacularization of politics, and as some people accuse her of capitalized misery, provocate spectacularization, no? And a lot of adjectives, but basically she's not a very respected figure within the island at this moment. This is also one of these three. Okay, yes. One work that she was invited to do in Colombia, and also Colombian public reacted very strongly, no, because she was invited to go to the Academy of the Arts, and then to do a performance, and with the public money she buys cocaine and distributes it into the art audience, no? And then Colombian people were like, oh, thank you for coming here and rubbing in our face something we see every day, and with our tax money, then you have something else to work about, no? So there is this discussion, can we see this as working with the context, or working about the context, or representing the context? Some aspect of this work has more to do with mimetic appearance than to actually transforming anything about that reality or implying any other perception or change of view. Another question is like, is a show political enough when it doesn't care about the reception by its audience? Is it okay to speak about communities without creating communities? So these are some of the questions when we think about the existence or non-existence of political art in Cuba. And the third current would be these kind of artists that I've shown you, who play with the imagination and not with the dogma, who find imaginary cracks to occupy parts of the national narrative, no, that is performed daily in the public space. To be political as to be the actor of change in society, to transform the system, to improve the system, is not the same as to want to destroy the system or be radically against the definition of the system. No, there is this Candelario artist. This is the Efforting Lamb, which is a work that is kind of playing, no, parasiting, to quote my colleague, some attitudes of the art world. So in order to create a building to address the problem of lack of housing in Cuba, he decided to make an inhabitable sculpture and exhibit it in the Wilfredo Lam Contemporary Art Center. It sounds superficial when I summarize it so much, but this became later the new archive of the Fondo Nacional de Bienes Culturales. That would be like the new archive for the Heritage National Collection. No? So from construction is a sculpture, from a construction is a sculpture, and then it becomes a building and a collection in itself. No? Another example, it's WASA. This is an alternative Wi-Fi that he created as extended social sculpture, and he advertised it like that, not to get into problems with some local authorities. It's a very unique kind of Wi-Fi signal that comes from that antenna. So it's I don't know, I don't understand very well this word, but it's a bit just like a physical. If you distance yourself from the antenna, you don't have it anymore. You are not connected via satellite, no? And then to make an app, no, and to make like a whole community, if in our context may sound like something you would do every day, but in the context of Cuba, that you don't have access to internet and you have to pay for it, and there is a black market of the cards to access to the free Wi-Fi points, so it's complicated. And just to finalize, 1 minute, that one peculiarity of Cuba is that artists is an economy in itself. Artists are considered as privileged in the society from the point of view that they are freelancers. In 2010 or 9, you have an artist ID, for example, and you are allowed to perform, no, under your own risk, activities that we would consider more typical from our economic organization. And with this, for example, an architect doesn't have this, but an artist does. So the architect needs, in order to have other clients, to camouflage himself as or herself as an artist. And this is how LASA came to this idea. Candelario is the Cuban one, and Aurélie is his partner, and she's a curator from France. And they had basically an entrepreneurial idea that is something that artists are doing a lot now in the Cuban context. And again, entrepreneurial ideas, you have to be quite imaginative, no? Given the context. So basically what they have is like a dual management system. They have a cooperative of people who they are training into making interior design reparations in public buildings that belong to the municipality and they're falling down. So not private houses, but municipal buildings. They are that are embassies or these things that the regime actually wants to. They need to look good, no? So, and there is a lot of conditions for their workers. So they always have little gardens or nice cafeterias. So they specialize into this, and the interesting aspect is that they are not funded by the state for their cultural activities. They invented a company of a necessity that is happening. The buildings are falling down. We cannot, there is a law in Cuba, it's very complicated to make a new building. You have to restore what you have. So let's specialize into this restoration and interior improvement. And with the profits of that, they have the cultural platform who is inviting all these artists in the format of the residency to work with the community. So there is a fundamental difference between making the state your client than to being funded by the state. And the difference in the freedom that you have to organize, to have capacity, because the authorities need you to make yourself needed in this bureaucratic context, hyper-bureaucratic context of how art works in Havana especially. It's very interesting. So, and they have been existing for 10 years. They train the artists, and the artists who are working there as artists in these reparations, they also support in the production of the invited guests that make projects with the community that require, so like public monuments, because we're talking about contextual art and public art. Many interventions are permanent. So the person who works in LASA needs to know that there is this dual appreciation of art as decoration, but also the artistic projects that they bring. And yes, thank you.
Thank you.